right. The common thought over the 20th century, as research emerged around the two hemispheres of the brain, was that they had specific functions that were different. But that's largely been disproven now, and that functions like language or I don't know, motor patterns and facial recognition and stuff, they might be more localized on one hemisphere than the other, but generally the hemispheres work together to produce our behavior and our abilities to navigate the world and things. But the key difference that Ian McGilchrist talked about is the different ways that the hemispheres attend to the world. So the type of attention that they pay to the world. And you could reframe that attending to the world, you can reframe that as the hemispheres exist within two different worlds, based on the same physical plane that we live in, but the world that they attend to, the world they perceive, is different. And I might have touched on this in that episode, but I'll elaborate on this a little bit more. So the left hemisphere attends to the world as a series of decontextualized parts, right, that we can grasp and we can use for certain functions. Whereas the right hemisphere views the world in its whole context, right? Rather than seeing the small parts that we can maybe manipulate ourselves, the right hemisphere sees everything as it is, right? And it's kind of the way Ian McGilchrist talks about it is the left hemisphere attempts to break down and decontextualize the world of the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere creates a map of the world that the right hemisphere lives within. So let me give you some kind of example of this. A bird, I think it's a certain type, I want to say it might even be a domestic chicken, but I could be wrong about that. It's a type of bird. We looked at this study in A-level, and Ian McGilchrist talks a lot about birds and their two hemispheres of the brain. But essentially, I'll go along the lines that it's a chicken. I could be wrong. But this bird, it uses one eye, right? The right eye that links to the left hemisphere looks at the seeds that it's trying to peck at with its beak to eat. Whereas the left eye that's linked to the right hemisphere is looking around for predators. It's like these two kind of worlds. One is looking at this specific, very fine, detailed function of pecking at a seed in order to eat it. And the other eye is looking at the whole environment in its context, looking for potential danger. Now, why am I interested in this? Why does it matter? That's more important. It's important to me because I think the right hemisphere world is what Korzybski, this writer, called the unspeakable world that Alan Watts has talked about in many of his lectures. Which means that the right hemisphere deals with the world in its full complex context. So if we'd say use Alan Watts' example that he talks about in one of his talks, is he talks about looking at a leaf. Now what the left hemisphere wants to do is put that object into categories. Okay, it's a green thing, comes from nature, photosynthesizes, it's made up of a series of plant cells, that kind of stuff. Whereas the right hemisphere looks at that leaf in its whole context of that's a piece of Mother Nature. That's part of a large tree, that's part of a forest, it's a bit of a life, right? Does that make sense? I feel like I'm kind of waffling here. The other interesting thing about the right hemisphere is that it regulates our ability to understand things like metaphor and poetry, right? The right hemisphere world is better expressed through things like narrative and myths and music and art, rather than the left hemisphere things that are more like sort of objective science. And this is interesting. This is another example that I'll put in that kind of deals with this point that the right hemisphere is to do with metaphor. You need your right hemisphere to understand things like sarcasm. So let's say me and you are playing a board game, right? And I'm finding it boring. And I say, this is exciting, in that tone, right? Your left hemisphere hears the words and derives their meaning, which is, I'm saying this is exciting, which means I'm enjoying it. Whereas the right, and that's kind of out of the context of my tone and the environment we're in and the way my body language and my facial expression and stuff. Whereas the right hemisphere looks at everything in its full context, the way I've said the thing I've said, to understand the underlying meaning, which is that it's not exciting and that I'm being sarcastic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what my proposal at the end of the waffle. Now, Ian McGilchrist's book called The Master and His Emissary then goes on to talk about how the world that we live in has become much more. What's the right word to use? It's much more left hemisphere dominant.
Yeah.
So we're looking to optimize.
Yeah, I definitely.
Right? We're looking to break things down and understand them, and then try and use that as our advantage as human beings, inventing things, innovating, building things, grasping at things. Whereas the right hemisphere is maybe being less spoken about and appreciated. You know, our generation's view on art and music compared to 150 years ago might be very different. These right hemisphere ways of thinking, I think spirituality and religion are very right hemisphere. There's a lot of metaphor, a lot of art, a lot of symbolism, a lot of narrative. We're losing that side of our lives. And a nice way of thinking about it is the left hemisphere regulates the known world, right? The things that we can grasp and understand. Whereas the right hemisphere regulates the unknown, the territory that's not yet been explored. And in my life, I want to, not all the time, but I want to work on my ability to see the world through the right hemisphere, to appreciate art, to appreciate poetry, to appreciate mythology. And yes, use the left hemisphere when I need it, and still have that rational scientific capacity in my mind. But when I drop into the unspeakable world, the world of the right hemisphere that sees the beauty and complexity as it is, not needing to explain it with words or images, and experiencing it at its truest level, the more I do that, I find a level of peace in that. So I've just talked a lot there, but tell me what you think.
I really like it. It makes a lot of things make sense. Like it's kind of like the thing that's built in you to make you, like, certain people more conscientious, certain people more open. It sounds like the right hemispheres where, like, your creative sort of thoughts come from, like your play, and that's kind of one of our goals of the podcast. Is like, that's where open-mindedness comes from. That's where looking deeper comes from. That right hemisphere, and yeah, I don't like it's kind of also maybe rational versus irrational, and there's a lot of society that I can agree with that point of that they're becoming heavily left hemisphere. So what I would then ask is then, how do we become more right hemisphere?
It's a great question. Having appreciation for truths and beauty that words don't do justice. That's how you tip into the right hemisphere. You know, if you listen to a real beautiful piece of music, it's a right hemisphere experience. You can't really describe, like, listen to a great opus from a grand sort of composer from the Baroque period, right? You can't really describe what that's like in words. Yeah, it sounds nice. You know, it's beautiful. You're using a word to describe an experience, which is very, very suboptimal. And you listen, or you watch a Shakespeare play, you know, the left hemisphere will look at the specific narrative that's going on between the characters, but the right hemisphere attends to the fact that Shakespeare's play is representing a fundamental component of human nature, right? It's like seeing like we say, the deeper context behind things, slipping into that world. How do you do it? I mean, I think this is one of those questions where I have to say, do I have a complete answer to that? I don't know. I would say surrounding yourself with things like art and music and poetry and narrative and metaphor, the things that the right hemisphere feed on, in inverted commas.
But to go into the kind of sort of science behind it, is this something that we can grow? It's not like something that you're born with more of a right or a left?
I'd have to look into it more. In terms of the actual science on that, I don't know. I would like to presume that we have a certain disposition to favour one worldview over another, but I think it can definitely change across time. It's very malleable, and maybe a component of things like, I don't know, psychedelic experiences or religious experiences, people tap into that right hemisphere way of thinking. And I think way of thinking limits it. It's more of a way of being. It's a way of approaching reality. Like, I was definitely like I hadn't, maybe it's just a part of my development, just physical development, going through puberty and going into my late teens. But there was no consideration of the right hemisphere world when I was a kid. I had the same view of many people have, that going to art galleries is silly and a waste of time. Whereas these days, that sounds like a great afternoon. So I don't know, it's interesting. But what's the takeaway from all this waffle is that there are two ways of looking at the world and life, in a way. You can look at it at face value, or you can question what's maybe the underlying meaning of the things that we do, and what's underneath the kind of mental construction you've put over the world that you can understand and use. What about the world that you can't understand? What about the things you don't know? What about the things you can't explain? What about the things that are so beautiful or so terrifying or evoke awe in you that you can't just describe with words? Like when you see a sunset, or you're confronted with the size of the ocean, or when you're in a forest and you just have that sense of peace in nature. What is that? What is that world we don't know?
Yeah, my solution would be, this illusion face value world isn't the funnest world to be in. It's better to strip back the layers and discover the doors of perception and things like that. So I like to think that, I would assume most individuals have adequate amount of each hemisphere that you're born with and that you can work on. So there's something there, and you just need to expose yourself, and then from repeated exposure it might grow. Like that, like, because me before the podcast was maybe more of a right hemisphere person, and that first podcast we did where you spoke about ideas that I've never even heard of, but that hit me, and then that I thought really interested me, that exposed me. And so I think I got them the wrong way around. So that was my left, but then my right hemisphere took those ideas and wanted to expose myself to more, and now that's where I'm kind of at now. Or there's a shortcut, which is just do psychedelics and it'll do it for you.